Good evening, everybody. Great to have you here at the Banque de Luxembourg tonight. For an event, I gotta say, if I read the topic, power, cash, and conscience, are they compatible? I'm really excited about what we're going to discover tonight around these very interesting speakers. So thank you very much for being with us tonight to our very first Leadership Forum. At this time around the year, we always had a very important event at the British Chamber of Commerce, which was our CEO Forum. We had the CEO Forum for, I think, the last 5 or 6 years, so it was always a big event. We always were very lucky and very happy to be able to invite you here to the Banque de Luxembourg. And, well, we decided to a little bit change what we've been doing so far. So with the new board, with new teams, we decided to somehow revamp, reshape the project. First of all, we were stuck with the idea of a CEO forum, and then we said, come on, let's do something completely different. And that's where all the members of the People and Leadership group came in. So I think they did an amazing job trying to redefine what we could do in this kind of flagship event that we have been advertising for quite some weeks now. So first edition of the British Chamber of Commerce for Luxembourg Leadership Forum. And I would like to thank, of course, very much the people of the People in Leadership group, mainly Sarah and Claudia, for the work they've done tonight with all the members of the People and Leadership group. I would like to thank, of course, Banque de Luxembourg for kindly hosting us here at this magnificent space. I would like to inform you that we're going to be filming this event, so it might be that the camera is going to move over to the public at a certain point in time. So I hope you will not have a problem with anything being on photos or on film. Furthermore, of course, I would like to thank our sponsors tonight, because we were sponsored by Mindforest. We are also on stage, so thanks a lot to Mindforest, to Jill Saville, to JS Associates, and to Lux Dates, and to Wagner and Associés, who have been kindly sponsoring the event tonight. Last information, we might ask you your point of view concerning a couple of the questions that are going to come up here on stage. So I would like to invite you up there. You get menti.com. If you could already take out your mobile phone, type menti.com, and you have a code. And when you insert that code, you will be rerouted to a page where we're going to ask you questions, ask your point of view, and that will give us an amazing input also for what we are talking about here on stage. So without further ado, I would like to pass the mic to Sarah. Thanks again, and have a very inspiring evening.
Thank you, Dan. So, in the past 5 years alone, there have been several highly visible examples of the consequences of power, cash, but perhaps not enough conscience, leading to serious outcomes. In 2015, we found out that Volkswagen had fitted 11 million cars worldwide with software that controlled the diesel emissions of their cars, but only in a laboratory setting. This had been happening since 2008. The same year, in Brazil, the Mariana Iron Ore Tailings Dam, joint owned by Vale and BHP Billiton, suffered a catastrophic failure, claiming the lives of 19 people and causing the worst environmental catastrophe in Brazil's history. In 2016, the Wells Fargo account fraud scandal in the US was brought to light, with 1.5 million savings and checkings accounts and another 500,000 credit card accounts opened on behalf of clients, but without their consent. In 2018, the motorway bridge in Italy, in Genoa, collapsed, claiming the lives of 43 people. And in early 2019, so only this year, again in Brazil, another iron ore tailings dam near the town of Brumadinho burst and killed 248 people, many of whom were having lunch in the company's canteen at the time. The dam was owned by Vale, the same company that was involved in the 2015 catastrophe. The list could go on, and I'm sure you could all add your own examples to that list. None of these situations happened overnight, and in the case of the Brumadinho Dam, the exact same thing had happened 4 years earlier. The data was there. In all cases, financial profit was the driving factor in the decision-making. Looking at these cases from the outside, it seems clear that unethical choices were made and that those leaders and those decisions should have been stopped. Tonight, we're very, very pleased to have 4 experts with us who are going to help us understand why these situations come about why unethical leadership happens, and what also we can do to prevent it. This is not a political discussion, it's much more taking a close look at human behaviour and the consequences of human behaviour. Why do people take the decisions that they do? And what does it take to speak up in the face of adversity? How can leaders, and indeed all of us, make better decisions?
So we welcome tonight on stage, in alphabetical order, Marcus J. Ball. Marcus is a crowdfunded private prosecutor who believes that elected public office holders should be held legally accountable when they lie to the public.
We would also like to welcome Professor Dr. Katrina Bramstedt. Katrina is a professional ethicist and the founder of Ask the Ethicist, LLC, and chief executive of the Luxembourg Agency for Research Integrity. Katrina believes that power, cash, and conscience are indeed compatible.
We welcome Guy Kerger. Guy is the founder and managing partner of Mindforest, whose mission as a change management consultancy is to help organizations develop their capacity to succeed.
And last but not least, we have Professor Dr. Markus Mueller with us tonight, psychologist and professor of management, who believes that unethical behavior is just a part of being human.
So, as this is an interactive event, our first question tonight is for you, our audience. So please whip out your phones, go to mentimeter.com and answer the question, power, cash, and conscience. Are they compatible? Yes or no?
Oh. This is great.
There is Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi in BDL. If you see, what's the one?
Luxembourg.
Luxembourg, it's free.
To Luxembourg.
Okay, another 30 seconds voting. Another 10 seconds, and then we'll carry on talking. Vote still coming in, or are we done?
Yeah, I think we're done.
Great.
Oh.
Oh,
It's a representative vote at this point, yes?
Yeah. Katrina,
Yep.
you have made your life's work to study ethics.
right.
And in your work, what have you discovered? Which are the components that lead to unethical behavior?
It's a great question, and it's something that whether I'm consulting or teaching, it comes up all the time. There's this concept, and it's called the fraud triangle. And there's 3 points to this triangle, and one of them is pressure, opportunity, and decision making. And we've all got pressure, whether it's in our jobs or at home or in our finances, and those pressures will never ever go away. And really we all have opportunities because we're not always watched, and neither should we be. That would be a little bit too oppressive. Nobody wants that. But it's how we make decisions and learning how to make ethical decisions, ethical choices, how to do that. That way you can avoid the pitfalls of, let's say, fraud or misconduct. So it's this fraud triangle thing. Yeah, that's really what I think it's wrapped up in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Marcus, think about the fraud triangle and the fact that even intelligent individuals support bad decisions sometimes, or even immoral decisions. Can you tell us a bit about the psychology, why that happens?
Well, let me first go back to the original title of the conference. Say power, cash, and conscience. There are two groups of people in society, the one with and the one without conscience. The one without conscience we call psychopath or sociopath, right? And usually, statistically, 1% of population are psychopathic somehow in that spectrum. Of the senior executives, it's somewhere between 4 and 5%. And there's a gray zone between 10 and 15% of people that show psychopathic characteristics or patterns. That actually is quite a high number. In my own research, it showed that large organizations where you have more than 5,000 employees, I had over 24% that showed psychopathic patterns. Now, that's obviously a big issue. Just in comparison, when you look at inmates in prisons, on average between 20 and 25% of people have psychopathic patterns. Secondly, intelligence, specific to your question, intelligence has not been shown to be any correlate to any unethical or ethical behavior. Instead, what has been shown is that unethical behavior is related to our instinctive survival mechanism. So when we go back, let's say 30,000 years into the Stone Age, the individual was faced with adversity in the weather, was faced with lack of resources, was faced with the saber-toothed tiger, was faced with competition, competing for a spot in a group. So in order to get into that group, people had to make a deal. They had to trade. It was kind of what we would call today a cost-benefit analysis. How much of their individual freedom would they have to give up to be part of the group that would give them shelter, right? Now, we managed over 30,000 years, fast forward again, to get ourselves out of the Stone Age. Unfortunately, we haven't made the progress to get the Stone Age out of ourselves. This mechanism is still part of us, even though the iPhone updates the operating system every week or every month or so. The genetic code only updates every hundreds of thousands of years. So we're still the same people. When you go outside and you see all these wonderful people in these wonderful suits and dresses and so on, we are still Stone Age people with our instincts. So what we're trying to do with unethical behavior is single-handedly get a better hand, capitalize on opportunities, reduce threats. So in one way, it's the instinct driving our behavior. Now, in our developed societies, we have something called self-control, and it's the interplay of the instinct versus the self-control of the person that causes then the behavior to happen or not. Now, the problem obviously is we are all not descendants of people that faced with a saber-toothed tiger were making a list of pros and cons, right? We are all descendants of people that acted immediately to survive. We are all descendants of the survivors. So our instincts, the instincts of our ancestors were very strong, and so are ours, because we are the descendants. So overriding those instincts is a pretty elaborate task. And the stronger the instincts are, the stronger the impulses from the environment, the more difficult it is to override them. I'm not trying to excuse unethical behavior here. I'm just trying to explain a mechanism. Thirdly, and finally, I talked about cost-benefit analysis. That's what we usually do today. There's also another school of thought in terms of ethics and ethical behavior, which is called categorical, ethical or moral reasoning. Categorical, in terms of compared to cost-benefit, is not looking at the result or the consequences of your behavior. It's just a category of saying that's something I don't do. I wouldn't kill anybody just to save the lives of 100 others. I just don't do that. I just don't kill people. I'd rather have the other 100 people die than killing one person myself. That's the category of people that most of us do cost-benefit analysis in our decision-making. Categorical people are the types of whistleblowers, for example, and maybe Marcus can give us more insights into what it means to be a categorical person.
Marcus, indeed. When you decided to take Boris Johnson to court for lying to the public during the referendum, what motivated you, and what was your cost-benefit analysis?
First of all, thank you all for coming and for having me. I really appreciate it. I've never been to Luxembourg before, so thanks for inviting me. For me, it was growing up in the UK, seeing 3 examples of the damage caused by lying in politics over and over again. So growing up as a kid, I was aware of the possibility that the Iraq War may have been started on potentially false information. So that's a Labour Prime Minister. Then later on, as I got older, when I first voted in a general election, when I was old enough to do so, I voted for the Liberal Democrats because I liked their campaign of no more broken promises, and I thought that was quite an attractive thing to vote for. Unfortunately, as most of you may have known, the person who got into power as Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, one of the first things he did was break one of his promises, so that was a mistake. And the third example would be recently in the UK with the referendum and the conduct of politicians on both sides of the debate, many of which lied, and in my view, many of which tried to cheat their way to victory. And what motivated me to start was just thinking, this has happened 3 times in my life. This is clearly a massive problem, and nobody seems to be doing anything about it. And I came across an article on the internet by a young barrister called Anthony Iskander, who theorized the possibility of using what is quite an old English common law offense called misconduct in public office to prosecute a politician for lying to the public on a repeated basis. And so I thought to myself over those few days, can I do this? Should I do this? Is it possible for me to raise the money? And to answer your question, the equation I had in my mind was, can I raise the money? Yes. Is it morally correct? Yes. Is it legally correct? It would seem so at this early stage. Let's find out. And when raising money, be honest about whether or not it will be successful. You can't guarantee it. And in terms of risk to myself personally, I knew that if I lost, there would be a huge financial cost. I knew that the press would attack me for it. I knew that there would be a lot to lose. But for me, the biggest motivation is this ideal. If you could prove that it is illegal for a politician to lie to the public, you could set a precedent in the English common law, and if that precedent was confirmed by the Supreme Court, that precedent could be influential in other countries around the world, and I think that would just be beautiful. That would be a wonderful legal principle to set, that elected public office holders, who we need to be able to trust as a society, cannot lie to us. I think that would have a trickle-down effect on society in terms of values, in terms of what's acceptable and what's not. And I think those 3 big examples I witnessed as I grew up, I would hope would not happen again. So I was aware of the risk, but they were the motivations for doing it.
Great.
I don't regret it at all. I don't regret it.
Good, great. So over to audience question number 2. So we've heard a little bit about various reasons for unethical behavior and people standing up for it. But what do you see as the actual causes for unethical behavior? So we've got a long list of you to choose from there. Greed, perhaps? Is it maybe jealousy or revenge that causes unethical behavior? Or is it maybe more ignorance or helplessness, or perhaps even disinterest, or any other reason that you might come up for? What do you think are the reasons for unethical behavior when you see it? Well, we'll keep going to 35 at least, because that's how many we had for the first question. Looks like it's going to be fairly unanimous. Right. Oh, 37. Fantastic. Right, well, I think the picture's pretty obvious. Thank you for your votes. So we have 25 who've identified greed as what they believe is the driving cause for unethical behavior. And hopefully we can shed some more light on whether this is indeed the case in the next few minutes. So, Guy, just a question for you now. Many companies have mission statements. Many companies have values that often include some kind of ethical aspect. From your change management experience and working with various companies, how do they actually ensure that these values or value statements are successfully implemented?
They don't. In fact, the idea of the values companies are writing down is more an idea. In fact, that's not the values of the company. That's something the managers imagine what they wanted to have in a prospective way where they wanted to go, but where the company wants to go, not they want to go. So it's a communication tool for the companies to show what they want to have, but they don't normally not do a lot of things next to communication to really play this role model, because very often we see that the values are defined, but the first not to respect the values are the management who has defined it or has validated the values, which makes that people will not believe in it. Very often it's also due that to the fact that the rotation of the managers in the company. So they come in a company, new management is there. Very often they redefine the strategy, they redefine the vision, and they redefine, of course, also the values which go with that, which, in fact, when you look at 10 companies, normally you have 10 times the same values. You find always respect, which is the first one. In fact, you find it everywhere. And this is the one which is less used, the less lived by, because, in fact, how the people treat each other, how the managers treat the people. So it's not a thing which is really used to govern the company, mostly. But there are some companies which really do, which try, because it's a powerful tool. You can really use it to do so, but as I said, most don't. Most don't. And for example, there's a company in Luxembourg which has defined its values some years ago, and they believe a lot in that. So everything they do, they ask questions about that. So when they take a decision, they look at their values and say, okay, is the decision in line with my values? And now they change something very important, which makes that they can endorse these values in the company. In fact, they have thrown away all their evaluation questions you do with people at the end of the year, which is another problem. But doing the evaluation with the people, they don't do it anymore with all the stats and all the numbers they got from finance and from human resources. They have thrown that all away. And they have taken their values and translated it into behavior, saying that, for example, they have modern as a value, and the behavior is, are you creative? Are you creating new things? Are you proposing new things? And all the evaluation is about this behavior. So it's, in fact, they measure or they discuss with their employees and also with their managers only on behavior. How do you behave? How do you behave with the client? How do you behave with your colleague? How do the manager behaves with his staff? And based on that, they can really succeed in making them live. But as I said early on, most stop with a nice brochure, some posters, some nice videos, some road shows, and some silly questions in a study a year later, but they really not endorse it or try to make it live. It's just there for window dressing.
So that's not promising.
No.
A question for Marcus Ball. Today we see a lot of leaders operating in a gray zone, and that is something that you also illustrated. If we take this away from the organizational context to wider society, from your point of view, what's missing?
I mean, I would say in the political space, I think that political leaders should have the same legal limitations placed upon them that corporate company directors do, to a greater extent. So if you're a company director in the UK and you lie to shareholders, you can be facing very serious criminal allegations in court, potentially. If you're a company holder, a self-employed person, and you lie to the customs HMRC, and you say, look, I haven't spent this money on this, I spent it on this instead, then again, you can face very serious cases against you in court. So why should it be that a politician does not face these same rules? Why is it that an elected public office holder can go on television and claim to everybody, to millions of people, that we send £350 million a week to the EU when they know that we don't? This is not something which should be permitted. It's almost as if, to answer the question, their power is so great and they're so senior that it's overwhelming in its sense of how awful this is, and so nobody acts against it. And in my personal experience, bringing this case to court, people at the top, senior, very powerful people, and in this case, the Prime Minister of the UK, they are surrounded by people who feed off of them for their power. So you have newspapers, you have some lawyers, you have people who are very senior in society. They get their power from that establishment base. They are not, those people are never going to help you. They are going to defend this person at the top who they rely upon for their power. It doesn't matter really what they've done to some extent. They will defend them and they will protect them, because by protecting that person, they're protecting themselves. So, yeah, I think I've certainly learned from doing this work that that's one of the biggest reasons why people at the top exist in this grey area, because so many people around them protect them. It sucks, actually, to be honest.
So, what can we as the people, do to create accountability within the system?
You can elect politicians who will support an act of statute which makes it illegal for politicians to lie to the public. And that is one of the things I intend to be lobbying for over the next year. You can outright refuse to vote for politicians who you know are lying to you. Many people don't have a problem with it. Many people consider it to be okay. And I find that to be very frustrating. And they place how much they like a politician over their honesty with the public. Because the problem is that if a politician is going to lie to someone you don't like to benefit you in some way, it's very likely that they're going to lie to you about something else later on as well. So the question I'm trying to answer at the moment, actually, the question you're asking is, what can we do about it? I'm trying my best to find out. That's what I'm trying to do, yeah.
Well, we're not expecting universal answers from you.
Thank you.
So you mentioned lawyers, and Katrina, as we were preparing this panel, we were talking about the fact that companies do tend to have large legal departments to protect the interests of their company. Should this be balanced with ethicists and an ethics department in some way?
Yeah, firstly, a stipulation. I like lawyers. I got nothing against them. I think they have there's a great role for them in corporate life, but they do have a very unique lens in how they work in the corporate setting, and it's very much with regards to compliance and regulations in the law and such, and that's appropriate. That is certainly their scope. But when the ethicists come into corporations, we have a bit of a different lens, and we bring sort of another toolbox with us when we do our work. And we, in fact, do try to, as this gentleman, my colleague here, was saying, we really try to operationalize what companies have. It's so easy for a company to write a code of ethics or a value statement, a mission statement, and all this and that. And they look lovely. You know, you can put them on your website with some beautiful images, and it looks fantastic. But if you're not operationalizing any of that, it's really meaningless. It doesn't mean that you have integrity because you have those little things on your website. So corporate ethicists are quite good at doing what we call organizational ethics and helping companies operationalize the values and principles that they really need to be espousing to, or they say they want to espouse to. So there is indeed a role for ethicists in the corporate world, absolutely.
And how do we convince companies that they should be hiring them?
I think that I think you have to show yourself as an ethicist to be value added, because a lot of people haven't even heard of us. A lot of people don't know that there's this entity called a professional ethicist, but some of us have track records and we can show the value added, and then corporations can take us on. But there are some very big companies, and I've worked for them, and they're more than happy to say that, yeah, we have an ethicist on board. And it's a person that is a go-to person for anybody in the company, not just the CEO to grab when he or she has a dilemma, but anybody across the board at any level of staff can reach out to the ethicist with a question. Yep.
Thank you.
So, Mueller, companies are driven by financial decisions, and shareholder value is certainly an important factor. Yet studies have shown that thinking about money impacts decision making. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and the consequences?
Yeah, just following on from what Katrina said. Most organizations I work with, when it gets to ethics, they're like whatever is legal is ethical. Because it's the easy algorithm for them, because ethics is too complicated, and we just talk to the lawyers, they get sign off, and that's it. I think what we're underestimating in general, it's not just in the ethical debate, in general, is that we are underestimating the human factor. There's not enough focus on people, who we are, how we behave, what triggers our behavior, and the psychological consequences of money is one stream of research that has grown since the turn of the century, because money is such an important factor. Money, coins, bills, treasury, all these names, capital, everything around that. And what all these studies show is that when the thought is in your head, you don't even need to see it, you don't even need to have earned it. Just having the thought of money in your head gives you a feeling of independence. Remember talking about the cost-benefit analysis you're doing before? You're giving up some of your independence for complying with the rules of the group that gives you shelter. Having the thought of money in your head gives you the feeling you don't need to compromise. You can be yourself, so to speak. So what you can see is that people that have the thought of money in your head, they are more individualistic, they are less helpful, they're more self-focused, they're more aggressive, antisocial, and so on and so forth. More short-term focused than long-term focused. Basically, the whole arsenal of things you saw in the financial crisis, for example. And you can also see that it's more imminent in industries that deal more with money than others. So it's very imminent in the banking and in the financial services, like insurance company industry, than in other industries. And as a result, the question is, how can you, unless people are aware of it, especially in the leadership team, how do you deal with that issue? It's a human factor, and if you have this algorithm of as soon as it's legal, it's ethical, you're going to have another financial crisis unless you address the human factor.
Thank you.
All right. Well, speaking of humans, what prevents us from speaking up is our next question for the audience. So, might it be a fear of ridicule, perhaps, that you're going to get laughed at if you speak up? Fear of negative personal consequences, for example, to your career? Is it a fear of being outcast? Is it just maybe apathy or helplessness? Or are you afraid to be negatively associated with the issue at hand? Or perhaps any other topic that you might be thinking of? Right, it looks like we have a clear trend again with this one. Let's go again till we have our 35 minimum. See if that makes a difference.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Right. Wow. 39, 40, 41. A clear winner, it seems, Claudia. What do you think?
Indeed. So fear of negative personal consequences to the career seems to be, according to our audience, one of the main reasons why people don't speak up. Now, Guy, how can companies move away from a culture of fear to a safe environment where people feel empowered to speak up?
It's quite easy. You change management. Sooner or later you have to, because you can't manage a company if you get only half of the information. So we saw some companies where no bad news for the board. That was the motto. And they changed management, and afterwards it was better. The problem is if you, on the long term, don't have all the information, you can't take the right decisions, first of all. Second one is you hire people because they are intelligent, because they have studied, they have ideas, they are creative. And then when they are in the company, you tell them, don't say anything. So that's absurd. So that doesn't work, and on long term that doesn't work. And every company we saw that which goes in that direction has not much success on the market, and they have to change it sooner or later. An example where, in fact, it's very visible. It's when you take the plane and you land here in Luxembourg, and I presume, or I hope so, it's everywhere. The guys who control the radar when you are landing or flying away, they have what's called a no-blame culture. In fact, they are not blamed if they do an error. So that's the idea. The idea is to say, if you make an error, in fact, so it was possible for you to make an error because perhaps the procedure was not right. You had to do double shifts, so you were tired, etc. But it's not your fault. Okay, when you do it the third time, we have to think it over. But on the first time, it's not your error. Why are they doing that? Because if you make an error and you hide it, next time you make that error, it can have consequences on having lives because the plane is crashing down. So, and they don't want the plane to crash down, so they have to detect all possible ways to avoid errors. And you can only avoid errors if you say, okay, no blame culture. For example, you have a similar thing if you look at the people, how many people go to the doctor in the company. So when you have a very low number of people who consult the doctor in the company, that means that in fact in the company people are fearing that has consequences on their career if they are too often ill. But even if they are ill and they are working, it's not good for the company. So if you have in a company these numbers, sometimes companies say, okay, nobody has consulted our local doctor. That's suspicious. So fear is not a good way to make evolve your company to detect errors, because the errors are there, the bad news are there, they exist, and if you don't report bad news to the board can't work.
Do you have an example of where you saw a change in the company culture when the management was changed?
Yes. Yes. In fact, in this company, it was that the board was very far away from the people. So the board was the board, and even in the board, everybody was sir. There was no collaboration in it, and no bad news for the board. Then, in fact, somebody who the shareholder said, okay, it's not working on the long term. This thing, we have to be more modern, more fast, more innovative, and they changed the CEO in the company, just the CEO, one guy. And this guy succeeded in saying, okay, that's not the way to behave in my company. He went down on the floor, he was talking to everybody in his company, and there were thousands. He went down, he talked to the guys, and that started to change. Some people or some departments in that company had never seen a member of the board before in the last X years. He was the first one to go to the floor and to create this respect, to listen to them, to help them, and to give feedback. And based on that, the company culture changed completely, and today it's much more competitive, innovative company, and also the people are much more engaged in that company than it was before. If they would have continued in the way before, they wouldn't exist anymore today.
So it's relationships, positive relationships, meaningful relationships.
It's meaningful relationship, and it's always, as in change, it's always one. One has to do it. It can be the CEO, it has bigger impact on the local level. One guy has to change it, and then he gives the example as you want to give the example, and then it can change, yes.
Thank you. Great. So changing the topic slightly, over to you, Marcus. So information is available on the internet, social media, Facebook, Twitter, etc. So it's available and spreads very quickly. Do you have any ideas how we might be able to use that fact positively to counterbalance fake news and the polarizing discourse that we see out there?
No.
That was a concise answer.
I think if anything moves quickly, it's probably likely to be BS. In order to understand a system or a problem or a story, you have to spend huge amounts of time carefully reading through it, reading other opinions, understanding the evidence, looking at everything in depth, and that takes hours, weeks, months. Doing the prosecution work that I've been doing, I've been in the press interest for far more than I ever have before. And one of the biggest things I've noticed is how much stuff journalists just make up because they have no time. They need to make a story really fast. It needs to be online in the next few hours. So they churn out a story, and sometimes it's nice. Sometimes they're saying something nice about me, which just isn't true. And sometimes they're saying something which is not so nice, which isn't true. But it's this addiction to speed. It's fast food news. In my opinion, I don't think human beings are clever enough to understand and produce something truly honest and high quality quickly. It just takes too much time. So no, I don't have any ideas, sorry.
And can we catch out politicians who've perhaps said one thing, a few years back, and that's been published on social media, or indeed other senior leaders, not just politicians, and then have contradicted themselves later on?
Well, yes, contradicting yourself is interesting, but in my view, it's not of interest to a criminal case, because in the future you can change your mind about something, and we can't penalize people for changing their mind. Of interest to our case, in terms of technology and how it can be used, is and a part of the case that most people don't understand is how indebted I am to Getty Images. Getty Images archives, BBC archives, Sky archive. The reason this case has never happened before is not because of the law, it's because of media archives. We have these huge archives full of footage of politicians speaking over and over again. And what made our case possible to bring to court was access to those archives. So it's not a quick solution, but that's something which has majorly helped us. Without those archives, doing a case like this wouldn't be possible, because you wouldn't be able to prove what a politician had actually said. Sorry, I'm covering a few different things there.
No, that's fine. That's interesting. Yeah.
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
So, Markus Müller, if we think about the 75% of CEOs who are not psychopaths, what would help them to keep their moral compass on true north?
I think, again, behavior is always the result of a person interacting with the environment. I think if you want to give them this moral compass, there are two things. One is working on the person, one is working on the environment. Working on the person, in my research, I discovered, going back to the original question with the money and the psychological consequences, I interviewed around about 300 senior executives, and one of the questions was, how many best friends do you have? And compared that to a population of non-executive people. And the statistical average of the senior executives was 0.4. And for the non-executive people was 4.5 or 4.6. So there's a certain degree of isolation. There's a degree of, I wouldn't say feeling lonely at the top, because it's self-designed, because people don't trust anybody. I think from a leader's perspective, if I want to keep the moral compass, it's very important for me to have a good team of people around me I trust, and people I can talk to, give me input, who I don't steer, who I'm more or less not the top of the pyramid, I'm the bottom of the pyramid, providing the context for them to give me the input, which gives me then the moral compass.
So servant leadership.
Servant leadership type of things, yeah, there are other parts. I mean, there are all kinds of leadership models around. But it's more like seeing that it's no longer, the hierarchy is no longer top-down, it's actually bottom-up today. Looking at the circumstances and the situation, I think it's a governance issue. I think it's been only 3 or 4 weeks that this statement came out of the top 200 CEOs in the States that the shareholder value principle was no longer a meaningful one. I think what it's doing, going back to my original statement on unethical behavior being instinctive behavior, what the shareholder value principle does, it's bringing members of the board in competitive positions to each other. and having all these board members competing with other boards in another competitive situation. So you're putting them under pressure, you're putting them in competition. So what you're basically doing, you're arousing their instincts to behave in an unethical way to get the upper hand. So the question is, how do you, from a corporate governance perspective, how do you keep them safe? That they don't feel like they're fighting for their survival. Every 3 months the numbers come out.
Great. Katrina, so the million-dollar question really is for you then. We heard that you do believe that power, cash, and conscience are compatible. So could you explain a little bit the circumstances under which you think that is possible?
Sure. And it's funny, I read a great quote just a few days ago in the Financial Times, and I was so impressed I took a photograph of it and put it on Twitter. But it's from one of the executives who runs Levi Strauss in San Francisco, and he said, this is an exact quote, but this is, I'm paraphrasing here, something to the effect of, having principles doesn't make you a nonprofit, you see. And I thought, that's just fabulous, because, you know, being an ethical person doesn't mean you're all about poverty. That's not what it's about. There's nothing wrong with having wealth, absolutely nothing, and people shouldn't be ashamed to be wealthy. No way. But it's how do you acquire that, and what do you do with it? I wanted to show everybody this really wonderful issue of the Harvard Business Review that came out this summer. And so for all the business leaders in the audience, I hope you can get a copy of this still, because this issue is just chock full of advice, tips, guidance on what is it that can drive an ethical company, a successful company, meaning financial. And so it's not just me saying this, you can read it in here, but it's really about, at the very top, what is in your leader's DNA, so to speak? Who are they in terms of their integrity? And an analogy would be, I can go tomorrow and I can change my image. So I can change the color of my hair. I could go brunette tomorrow, and then the next day I could go, let's say, pink or blue, and then I could change it back to blonde. All I've done is change my image, right? But your integrity, especially as a corporate leader, is hugely important. And when that gets damaged, you can't just fix it overnight. You can't go to the salon and ask for a tune-up. So protecting your integrity is hugely important, much more than protecting that image, which can change. It can come and go. You can sort of refashion who you are. But your integrity is something that you carry with you. And as a corporate leader, it's really got to show and be operationalized in your company. And again, there is nothing to say that because you're going to be an ethical company that you're going to go nonprofit. Absolutely not.
Right. So what advice would you give a leader then trying to build an ethical company? What are the sort of 3 key ingredients that you would like them to?
Well, I would say the main ingredient is, firstly, that corporate leader needs to look inside him or herself, and what is it about their integrity? How is their moral compass looking? Is it broken? Does it need a tune-up? That's really what needs to be looked at, is their own personal integrity, which has to do with things like honesty and transparency and various things. It's not about working hard and how many hours you've put in at the office and are you kind. It's bigger than that. So it's being reflective, and I have to say a lot of corporate leaders don't have that reflective tool honed, and that's a really important skill for an ethical leader. So yeah, that's what I wouldn't do it as a 1, 2, 3. I think if you can harness that first one of personal integrity, then I think you're on your way.
And presumably have people around you who can...
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, if you're a person of integrity, you're not going to hire and put in around you people who don't have integrity. Right. But it starts with you first as the corporate leader, and then you can be building that team around you for sure.
Right.
Yep.
Exactly. Thank you.
So the last question would be to all the panelists. what can each of us do, regardless whether we're leaders or not leaders, can each of us do to influence ethical decisions in our organizations or in the wider society? And I'm looking for a 60-second answer.
Oh, we have time.
Marcus Mueller, would you like to start?
I think as a first step, I would suggest identify and eliminate the psychopath. Because they create such toxic environments that the organizations and then the wider society suffers a lot from their behavior. Secondly, I think what research shows is that ethical behavior is also people immerse themselves in ethical environments when they see role models, which goes not only back to the top leadership people, but also individual leaders within the organization. So I think my suggestion would be, in order to fight this uphill struggle, to get it to a tipping point, that each of us should act and behave as a role model for others. And maybe thirdly, for political as well as organizational leaders, think of organization and society not in terms of heads, but in terms of hearts. I think that's how everyone would like to be treated.
Thank you. Guy, what are your thoughts?
I think I pick up the idea of the role model. So because very often you see that, in fact, people are not looking at how they behave, they look at the behavior of the others. And so they complain about it, but in fact they are the same. And everybody should be a role model. And everybody should try to behave in a way which is compatible with his own values. And to be a role model. I'm not just saying, okay, the others are not. And we made once an exercise where people were saying, oh, okay, our managers are bad, they are behaving that way. Then we asked them to study their own behavior in that team over a certain time, and then we were re-asking the question that they were behaving the same way as their manager. And when they saw that, we could start a discussion with their managers and to say, okay, we don't want that, and then they changed it.
So also that would be a movement from the bottom up.
Yes.
Thank you. Katrina.
Very similar to my two colleagues here. Like I said with the fraud triangle, don't be running and under so much pressure that you don't pull up that handbrake and do your own personal self-reflection, asking yourself, you know, what does my DNA, my integrity DNA look like? What are my values? What are my priorities? What are my principles? What am I using to make decisions? And is this appropriate? So it's having that reflective moment, but you're going to have to take the time to do that. And I know everybody is running and they're pressured and they've got budgets and they've got timelines and all these things. But unless you do that, you're going to be very tunneled visioned, and you need to have that moment for yourself to stop and look inward about your own ethics and how you're dealing with yourself, because it does relate to how you deal with others.
I would say that my company is going insolvent. I'm personally facing bankruptcy. The case has been defeated in the High Court, and there's only a small chance I can get it back into court. And I'm only 30, so I'm probably not the best person to give you advice. I would instead have a request. If you see somebody who is trying to do something which is potentially very risky, but has good intentions and is trying to benefit society at large, don't invest yourself and put yourself on the line, because that's self-destructive, but mentor them. Take them to one side, help them, introduce them to people, do whatever you can to help that person, because they definitely need it. One of my biggest problems with our case was I didn't have enough well-established, successful, powerful people in my corner. And when you go up against someone that famous and powerful, you need those people. So I can't give you advice, but if you see somebody doing something like that, then give them a hand.
Great. Some powerful insights there from all of you. Thank you very much. Well, as I've been listening to the debate, I've heard and made a note of a number of things. No blame culture was something we heard. The impact of the financials on our psyche and our decision-making as a result. We've talked about fraud triangle and the factors that might influence. and about one person's journey as well. So I'm sure you've got tons of questions as well, so we'd love to open these up to the room now and go with the questions. Is there someone from the P&L team who might be able to carry a microphone around? Lena, thank you so much. Great, we have a question at the front already. Thomas, don't you?
Yes, hello, my name is Thomas Flamand from the British Embassy here. About all the debates, there was something I was missing, was the facts world we're living in, where you have facts mainstream, which are well established, and where there's a lot of communication behind, either from corporates, either from politics, who try to sell their soup.
Right.
And this is all mixed in a very nice communication thing. And I was missing this a little bit in all the debate.
So do you have a question you'd like to add to make
It's
sure
not-
it's in the mix?
Yeah, well, if anyone can perhaps expand that.
On the topic. So
There's a communication.
yeah,
So you have lies,
yes,
you have facts which are corrupted,
right.
and then they were wrapped in a very nice communication that, well, what was true yesterday is not anymore true today.
So how do we deal with that?
And, yeah,
And how do
see
we
this kind of
right.
wrapping it in, that somebody is just putting up a fact, 3 weeks after communications changing the fact you are
right.
wrong.
Right. So the world of alternative facts you're alluding to. Right. So does anyone have a thought on alternative facts and communication?
There's one thing I would say in response to that is, with our case, the only reason we felt that we could bring a prosecution was because this particular politician was making claims about factual information which had been occurring for years and was published, freely available, and specifically sent to him in his capacity as a member of parliament. So if this individual were to repeatedly lie about that information, which has already been published and has occurred in the past, the argument that the situation has changed can't really be made because it's already happened before. It would be completely inappropriate to make a prosecution case based upon a prediction or an aspiration in the future, because that information can change. And if we did try to prosecute a politician for an aspiration or an ambition for the future, that would stifle political debate, and it would be a terrible idea. So I think you're touching upon a really important point there, is how do you identify a lie in comparison to a prediction? So.
Right. And perhaps some of our other speakers have insights on that as well. How do you know who is telling the truth these days, and how do you check out the claims of a company, for example, that something is true?
In the research setting, sometimes people come to us and they suspect something is deceptive. And so there's ways to go about looking at data through quarantining data and auditing it and things like that, and we look for outright fraud, but we also look for deception. And certain codes of conduct will describe then this as misconduct. So if you identify it, it will fall into the category of misconduct, whether it's deception or, let's say, fabrication or falsification, and then you can proceed down that path. But yes, sometimes people use spinning or deception to try to get what they want. Maybe they want more funding. So they perhaps spin the initial data that they have because they really want to get some more data because they're so passionate about the work that they're doing. But yeah, so that's one way of handling it. That's in the scientific setting, for example.
Right. Okay.
Early on, you very often people, you said, in fact, people in the vote, you said that there is greed in order to take decisions, and there were very few on competence. But I think very often managers in a company put up a communication on things, and the communication proves wrong on the long term because they are incompetent. In their role, they had not enough taken the reflection on taking the right decision. It's perhaps the same problem as the journalist who has to produce something quite quickly, and he didn't look at all the facts, discussing all the points with all the people concerned, and he thinks he has to take rapidly a decision which is wrong, and he proves wrong on short term and on long term too.
Mm-hmm. thank you. Anything to add, or should we continue to the next question? Okay, thank you.
Okay, if I may, I'm part of the British Chamber, so this is not a pre-prepared question, so my colleagues aren't expecting me. I was so inspired, though, by Katrina, the two Marcuses, and Guy, by what you said. I was nodding all the way through. However, if I can be a bit contentious, I totally agree with you that people need to take a look at themselves. If I'm a senior leader, let's think of the most senior leader you can, someone who models themselves on Donald Trump, for example. But if I were to ask someone like Donald Trump, you need to look at yourself and you need to see what your values are and what you believe in. He would say to me, I value family. He would say to me, I value America first. He would have his own set of values, his own set of ethics. So perhaps what you're really saying is it's that those ethics that those leaders have and those things that they believe in, those values, are perhaps not what those beneath them would like to see in general. Is that what you're saying in certain companies and organizations?
Well, I think in the case of Donald Trump, I don't think he's being honest with himself on what really his values are, but we're not supposed to get political, but I just really think that that's the answer to that issue. To the Donald Trump example, he's really not, he wouldn't be being honest with himself if that's what he's truly saying his values are, because boy, I could really go on this one, and I don't want to get in trouble. If you look at how he treats his wife and all of these things, I mean, I could go on, and I don't want to do that. So
perhaps we can
he's not being honest.
Perhaps we can have the psychologist explain where that disconnect comes from then. And
leaving the Trump example aside, right? I think if you have a psychopath,
going back to that,
he or she is not going to be very self-reflective, right?
Right.
So you have to spot them, identify them, and eliminate them. Now, obviously the problem is, and I'm drawing on David Frum here, who is a journalist in the US, who's wrote this book on Trumpocracy. Can you actually create an autocracy within a democracy? And it actually shows that even though there may be psychopaths and people might even spot them, nonetheless, you might have people voting for them. It goes back to what Marcus said earlier. It's been spotted that politicians lied to the voters and they're still voting for them. So what can you do about that? When you look at organizations, the single biggest impact factor on organizational culture is the leader or the leadership team. So I can only support what Guy said. If you want to change the culture of a place, you have to change the leadership team. There's no way around it. I actually had a situation where I worked for, or I did some research with a company here in Luxembourg and presented the results. And the result was that 86% of people were in the reds regarding stress, burnout, depression scales, and so on. And I presented that to the executive committee, and the executive committee, looked at me and said, "Well, maybe we have a couple of €1,000 to do something good for our employees, just to get it off the table, right?" And then we left the executive committee meeting, and the CEO came behind me and he said, "Well, we would really like to, for you after the research to work for us as a consultant, on this and implement this and so on and so forth." And I said, "Yeah, I would be all for it, but I would request you to make one change." And he said, "Oh, I'm the CEO, I can make any change you want." I said, "Well, you would have to leave the company."
did he take your advice, Marcus?
Unfortunately not. He's still on.
Good for
That's
you,
because you were a researcher, not a consultant.
Thank you. We have a question over here. Lynn is on her way. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you very much. My name is Isabella Ortega. I work as an internal auditor at an insurance company. And of course, one of the big topics that the companies always talk about is their reputation, which of course links into integrity, links into ethical behavior. And my ex-boss and I, we we were a little bit, we are Eastern Europeans, we are very skeptical and sarcastic. And we would always say, this reputational risk is such a big word and it's so overrated. When I think about the companies that you mentioned at the beginning, Volkswagen, Wells Fargo, and all the others, can you name one company of the big ones where that suffered a big scandal and reputational damage that really went down? Because, to be honest, I'm not aware of any. If you think about Volkswagen, we all still keep driving it. I don't, but we all still keep driving these cars and buying them. Normally, you'd expect this company to really suffer economically, but in the end, they don't. And same, with financial crisis, we all know how many senior managers went to prison in the US after the financial crisis. I think there was none, if I remember correctly. So I'm just wondering whether it's just these, the senior managers that are psychopaths, or we all just don't care somehow. I'm sorry. So I'm not sure I have a question. It's just something that always, comes back in my mind, and especially the examples that you mentioned.
So why are there no
at the beginning.
Consequences?
What are the consequences? Yes. Well, maybe you would like to comment or not. Just thank you.
Thank you.
Can I quickly ask you a question first before I answer? Was the VW scandal a big scandal for you?
Yes.
Personally?
Yeah.
Okay.
I never drove it.
Sorry?
I never drove one, but I would never buy one
Right.
anymore. For me, it was a big scandal.
Okay. Because one of the questions I would raise is, how big were these scandals really in the public perception? If they were really so big that we personally felt so touched by them, we would never buy a VW again, we wouldn't drive them, and so on and so forth. So the question I would ask first is, how big were these scandals actually? Were they scandals that were made up by journalists that wanted to sell newspapers and news? Or were they really such big scandals in themselves? When you look at some of the scandals, Arcandor, for example, in Germany, where the CEO of the former CEO of Bertelsmann, Thomas Middelhoff, he was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. When you look at Lehman's that went under, there are many cases where actually things happened, where people were sentenced. The question is, how big were these scandals really? Is it just a public perception based on news, social media, and so on and so forth, or does it really feel that way in the public perception? And is it for us as an individual or as a group to judge whether it was a big scandal if 80% of people out there don't seem to see it that way? That's what I would say. Maybe people should be punished, and they weren't, but you listen to some of the hearings that happened after the financial crisis, and it's just amazing what people got away with. I would have expected some people being sentenced, but apparently it was not. The system in itself was just self-containing. So it's for you and me and the people around us to change that, but how do we do that?
I would add something. Sometimes the damage from scandals is very well hidden, and it's quite hard to tell that there is damage. So I've had a scandal to do with my work. When we won the case initially in the magistrate's court in the beginning of the process, up until that point, the press had been quite friendly and polite. The moment we won, Daily Mail, Telegraph, Express, Spectator just went for my neck straight away, attacked me in various different ways. And one of the issues that was raised was my use of funding that I'd raised. So I crowdfunded the case, and despite living on next to nothing for about 3.5 years, I spent some money on some cupcakes as a gift for a legal team to say thank you for doing some pro bono work for me. And so what does the Daily Mail do? The Daily Mail prints a story with Marcus Ball spends £50,000 on cupcakes. No, I didn't. It's funny. My friends called me the cupcake prosecutor for a bit. And the Daily Mail, with respect to them, they did use the accurate figure, I think, at the end of the article to make up for it. So they can't be sued. Thank you, Daily Mail. But the damage that kind of story has done is not really that visible to the general public, I don't think, but it has affected me a lot. I get a lot of messages, a lot of people saying things about me. My reputation has just crashed enormously with people who read those papers. I can't do anything about it. If I go to a social event, I went to see a good friend of mine a few months ago, and she had a friend at the event, and her friend just spent about half an hour passively aggressively attacking me for my work. So sometimes these scandals have huge effects on people which aren't financial and aren't visible, but do affect them personally. So maybe if the world is a decent place, the VW people are having an awful time. Who knows?
Thank you. I mean, on reputational risk, I just wanted to add, I mean, there are companies that have gone under because their reputation suffered and their trust in them evaporated. For example, Arthur Andersen and Cambridge Analytica, tying in with your case, they went under when public's trust in them, when their reputation failed. Now, I'm probably not alone in the room to regret, Marcus Ball, that your initiative hasn't succeeded. I think I very much admire your courage in what you've done. And my question to you would be, what would it have taken in the past, or what will it take in the future to be successful, to prosecute intentional lies? And actually, you've only picked one out of a series of lies during that campaign. If you compare it, for example, to the prorogation case and the lies to the Queen, which were successfully prosecuted and where the lie was called out, and where Parliament was reconvened. So there are a few instances where lies are called out and prosecuted successfully. So in your case, I wish you all possible success going forward. What would it take to have been successful or to be successful going forward?
Thank you for your kind words. I appreciate it. My biggest weakness throughout the whole process was my lack of credibility. I'm not famous, I'm not rich, I'm not important or powerful, and I knew from a very early stage that I needed someone like that in my corner to lend credibility. If you just have one famous name consistently saying, this guy is not a lunatic, he has got value, it makes a huge difference. And unfortunately, because of what we were trying to do, it's such a big thing to do, to potentially put such a powerful, famous person in prison. It's very difficult to find someone who's willing to lend their credibility to you. And so in terms of what could happen in the past, if I could change one thing, I would have spent far more time networking and meeting people and speaking like this to try and find somebody who could lend me that credibility. As it was, I was very easy to dismiss. It's very easy to get rid of someone like me because I don't have that power on my side, especially when you're going up against someone who has such a hugely powerful group of people around him. To give you an example, when the case was first successful and it became a worldwide news story and it was all very exciting, Jacob Rees-Mogg spent an hour, I think, or 45 minutes on his LBC program just slating me. He's very powerful, he's very popular. I don't have anyone like that who can defend those claims against me. So that would be something I'd like to change if I was to do it over and over again. In terms of the future, the case is brilliant. The legal team and this case is fantastic. I can't be the one to bring it again. I don't have enough credibility. I'm now bankrupt. It is pretty terrible situation for me. But if we can persuade the police to, if we can persuade somebody with a bit more clout behind them to bring a very similar case, which is streamlined and has the errors that have been called upon by the courts taken out, then yeah, I have hope it can happen in the future. But somebody very clever recently told me that timing is very important, and it may be wise to wait until he's not the Prime Minister and the most powerful person in the country.
Indeed.
So my name is Mike de Doot. I work at Post Technologies. And my question is the following. With all the lies that we get told day and day, how do we still identify what is ethical or not, starting with the point that we don't actually know if it's true or not what they're telling us.
How do we know if something's true or not and whether it's ethical or not? Gosh. Shall we ask the ethicist.com?
Oh boy. Well, my organization does audits. So we actually look at the nitty gritty. So we do investigations, and we uncover what is truthful and what is fake and fraudulent, and then we produce opinion reports. So that's how we handle it. That's of course in the scientific setting. Organizations that do research, any type of research, whether it's medical, chemistry, it could be anything. So that's how we handle it. So we actually get a hold of that data.
Mm-hmm. So what could a layperson do? Perhaps I think that sounded like it was. What could a layperson do more of to identify whether a claim is true or not, rather than taking it at face value? What are some of the steps that any individual could take?
As I say, in fact, you try, as you said early on, you try to check your facts. You get one opinion. You get one opinion from your manager. You get one opinion from the company or the company's communication, and you have to check the facts. What you should do with every news you get. You take the opinion from somebody which is opposed to it. You take the opinion from a lot of people. More you get exchange with other people, more you get other viewpoints on the information, and based on that you can have a better view if it's true or it's not true. I think that's the only way you have. But if you consult if you read always the same newspaper, it's quite difficult.
I think you have to do your homework and look at it from different perspectives. I mean, the word for it, it's in research and science, we call it triangulation. So you look at it from 3, 4, 5 different perspectives, and if you still arrive at the same result, then you can actually, unfortunately, it's basically turning the world upside down. I mean, all this information technology promised us that we would have more information more readily available. And now instead of going out there and getting the information, we now spend the time on actually reconfirming whether it's actually true. So that's the trade-off we made, basically. But I think you have to do the homework yourself.
Yeah, and you have. It's not so easy. Not every information is true or false. It's not so easy. Some information are true in a certain context, in a certain moment. That's why, for example, when taking decisions in a company, sometimes you say 1 year later, you said it was the decision was wrong. Okay, it was wrong a year later, but in the moment when the decision has been taken, it was perhaps right, and it was good that a decision has been taken. So right and wrong is one point, and also is it ethical? It depends on your own values. If it's because you can have different standards on ethical.
Right. Jill.
Hello, I'm Jill Saville on the council. I was just thinking of certain things that are happening in the world, and I wondered whether the panel was generally more hopeful that things are going in the right direction. For example, we have cases like Marcus. I also see in the UK something called Led by Donkeys, which they're people who put up posters of quotes of what people have said before, and these posters follow politicians around, you know. So truth seems to be more important these days. Are there any more signs of hope in the world, do you think?
Wow.
I have complete hope that in time everything gets better. There's a great guy called Peter Diamandis who has it's a TEDx talk, sorry, it's a bit of a cliche to talk about it, but he opens with comparisons between child mortality rates, literacy, technology available to different age groups and different time sectors, and he just makes the point that generally, over time, everything we have is actually getting better. It's just we don't really see it that way because the news media constantly tells us what's wrong. I have faith that we are going to solve all of the problems we have at the moment, but it's going to take a few hundred years. Yep.
Anyone else hopeful? Great. Maybe one last question if there are any. Okay. Claudia.
So we've heard tonight a lot about power, cash, and conscience,
Yes.
and they seem to be compatible. So we've heard about all the different angles. We have also heard that it's hard. Speaking up is hard. It takes courage. It's risky, and people may feel alone who speak up. We have also seen that a voice can create a following, and that we can all be role models. So, at the end of the day, we all decide for ourselves whether we do the right thing as family members, employees, members of the wider society, as consumers. Now, doing the right thing is certainly hard, but it certainly is worth it. That's my takeaway for this evening. And with that said, I would like to thank our panelists, Marcus Ball,
Thank you very much.
Katrina Bramstedt,
Thank you.
Kerger, and Marcus Mueller for freeing up their busy schedules and being with us tonight. I would also like to thank you as an audience to participate in this discussion. Of course, I would like to thank the sponsors, Mindforest, Luxembourg, Wagner Associates, and JS Associates for bringing this event. I would also like to thank the British Council, the people who made this event possible. And I invite you to have a glass of Cremant with us, or a glass of water, whatever you wish, and use the opportunity to perhaps talk to the panelists one by one and exchange opinions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.